In World War II, Germany believed it had discovered the future of warfare. Not just stronger weapons, not just better strategies, but machines that could completely dominate the battlefield. At the center of this belief was one idea: if a tank could be made powerful enough, protected enough, and advanced enough, it could become unstoppable. This idea led to the creation of some of the most famous tanks in history. The Tiger Tank and the Panther Tank were not just upgrades of earlier designs. They were a complete shift in thinking. Germany was no longer trying to match its enemies. It was trying to surpass them in every possible way. The Tiger Tank was built with one clear purpose: absolute dominance. Its armor was thick enough to resist most enemy fire. Its 88mm gun was deadly accurate and extremely powerful. It could destroy enemy tanks from distances where it could not even be easily targeted. For soldiers facing it, the Tiger Tank was more than just a weapon. It was a moving fortress. The Panther Tank followed a slightly different approach. It combined strong armor with better mobility and a highly effective gun. Its sloped armor design made it harder for enemy shells to penetrate, increasing its survivability in combat. Together, these tanks gave Germany a powerful advantage, especially in the early stages of their deployment. On open battlefields, these machines performed exactly as intended. They destroyed enemy tanks, held defensive positions, and created fear among opposing forces. There are many accounts from Allied soldiers describing their encounters with German heavy tanks. They often spoke about how their own weapons seemed ineffective. Shots that would normally destroy a tank simply failed to penetrate the armor of the Tiger. In some situations, a single Tiger tank could hold off multiple enemy tanks. This created a sense that Germany had found the perfect balance of firepower and protection. But this perception was only part of the reality. Behind the strength and fear these tanks created, there was a growing problem that was not immediately visible. These machines were not just powerful. They were extremely complicated. Germany's approach to tank design focused on achieving the highest possible performance. Engineers added advanced systems, complex components, and highly precise mechanisms. Every improvement made the tank stronger or more effective in combat. But at the same time, every improvement also made the tank more difficult to build, maintain, and repair. The engines of these tanks were powerful but sensitive. They required careful handling and regular maintenance. The transmission systems, which controlled movement and speed, were particularly prone to failure under stress. Even experienced crews struggled to keep these tanks running smoothly. Unlike simpler tanks, which could continue operating even with minor issues, German tanks often required immediate attention for small problems. If a part failed, it was not always easy to replace it in the field. This created a situation where the tanks were incredibly effective when they worked, but increasingly unreliable over time. Another important issue was production. Because these tanks were so complex, they took longer to manufacture. They required more resources, more skilled labor, and more time. While Germany was producing smaller numbers of highly advanced tanks, its enemies were producing large numbers of simpler, more reliable machines. This difference would later become critical. At this stage, however, the focus was still on performance. German leadership believed that superior technology would compensate for smaller numbers. The idea was simple: one powerful tank could defeat several weaker ones. And in controlled conditions, this idea often worked. But war is not fought under controlled conditions. Battlefields are unpredictable. Machines are pushed to their limits. Crews operate under stress. Maintenance becomes difficult. Supply lines are stretched. In such conditions, reliability becomes just as important as power. This is where the first real problems began to appear. Some tanks started experiencing mechanical failures even before reaching combat zones. Others broke down after limited use. Crews reported issues with engines overheating, transmissions failing, and parts wearing out faster than expected. These problems were not always visible in reports or propaganda. On the surface, the tank still appeared strong and effective, but slowly The gap between design and reality was becoming clear. The German tanks were designed for maximum performance, but not necessarily for long-term endurance in harsh conditions. At the same time, the Allies were learning and adapting. The Soviet Union introduced the T-34, a tank that was not as complex but was highly effective in real battlefield conditions. It was easier to produce, easier to repair, and more suited to rough terrain. The United States focused on the Sherman tank, which emphasized reliability and mass production. It could be built quickly, repaired easily, and deployed in large numbers. These tanks did not always match the Tiger in direct combat, but they did something equally important. They kept working. This difference in philosophy created two very different approaches to warfare. Germany focused on building fewer, highly advanced machines. The Allies focused on building many reliable machines. At first, the German approach seemed superior. The power of the Tiger and Panther tanks created strong battlefield performances and reinforced a belief that advanced engineering was a key to victory. But over time, the weaknesses of this approach will become impossible to ignore, because a machine, no matter how powerful, is only effective if it can operate when needed. And as the war continued, Germany would begin to face a harsh reality. Their most powerful weapons were also their most fragile. The tanks that were meant to secure victory were slowly becoming a burden, and the failures that began as small mechanical issues would soon grow into something much larger. They would begin to affect entire operations. They would slow down advances. They would leave units vulnerable. And eventually, they would contribute to one of the most important turning points in the war. The fall of Germany's armored strength did not begin with a massive defeat. It began quietly, with engines failing, with gears breaking, with machines that refused to move. And this was only the beginning of a much deeper problem that would unfold as the war pushed these machines into the harshest environments imaginable. At first, the problems were easy to ignore. German tanks were still winning battles. Their firepower and armor continued to dominate many encounters. Reports focused on victories, on destroyed enemy tanks, on successful operations. But behind these successes, a different story was unfolding. A story that did not involve enemy fire. A story that began with something much simpler. Machines that refused to work. As German armored units moved across long distances, especially during major offensives, the strain on their tanks began to increase. These machines were no longer operating under ideal conditions. They were moving across rough terrain, through dust, mud, and uneven ground. And slowly, the first signs of serious trouble appeared. Engines began to overheat. This was one of the most common issues. The powerful engines that gave these tanks their strength also generated a large amount of heat. Under continuous operation, especially during long marches, the cooling system struggled to keep up. Crews had to stop frequently just to prevent damage. In some cases, tanks had to be abandoned temporarily to avoid complete engine failure. Then came transmission problems. The transmission system, which controlled how the tank moved and changed speed, was one of the most complex parts of German tank design. It allowed for precise control, but it was also highly sensitive. Under the stress of heavy weight and rough terrain, transmissions began to fail. Gears would break. Movement would become unstable. Some tanks lost the ability to move entirely, and when a tank cannot move, it becomes useless. These breakdowns often happened before the tanks even reached the battlefield. This created a serious problem for German commanders. They planned operations based on the number of tanks available, but as units moved forward, that number kept decreasing, not because of enemy attacks, but because of mechanical failure. In some cases, a large portion of tanks assigned to an operation never actually arrived at the front lines. They were left behind on roads, in fields, or along supply routes, waiting for repairs that could take hours, days, or sometimes never happen. Repairing these tanks was not easy. Unlike simple machines, German tanks required skilled technicians and specialized parts. Field repairs were difficult, especially under combat conditions. If a part was damaged or worn out, it could not always be replaced quickly. Supply lines were already under pressure, and delivering spare parts to the front was a challenge. This meant that even minor issues could take a tank out of action for long periods. Crews began to feel the frustration. They were trained to operate some of the most powerful machines in the war, yet they spent a significant amount of time dealing with breakdowns. Instead of focusing on combat, they had to focus on keeping their tanks running. There are accounts of crews working for hours just to fix mechanical issues, often under dangerous conditions, sometimes close to enemy positions. In many situations, tanks had to be abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could not be repaired in time. This had a psychological impact as well. The same machines that once gave them confidence were now becoming a source of uncertainty. A tank that might break down at any moment is not a reliable weapon, and reliability is critical in war. As these problems continued, they began to affect entire operations. Delays became more common. Advances slowed down. Coordinated attacks became harder to execute because not all units were able to reach their positions on time. This reduced the effectiveness of German strategies. Speed and coordination were key elements of their early success. But now, mechanical failures were disrupting both. At the same time, their enemies were facing fewer of these issues. Soviet and American tanks, while not as advanced, were more consistent. They could operate for longer periods without major breakdowns. When problems did occur, they were often easy to fix. This allowed Allied forces to maintain pressure and continue moving, even in difficult conditions. The contrast was becoming clear. Germany had tanks that could win individual battles. The Allies had tanks that could sustain entire campaigns. As the war intensified, the importance of this difference grew. German units began entering battles with fewer tanks than expected. Some units had to adjust their plans on the spot. Others were forced to delay operations, giving the enemy time to prepare. In fast-moving warfare, even small delays can have major consequences, and these delays were becoming more frequent. Another major issue was wear and tear. The heavy weight of tanks like the Tiger placed enormous stress on their components. Tracks wore out quickly. Suspension systems were pushed to their limits. Long-distance movement caused damage even without combat. This meant that tanks needed regular maintenance just to remain operational. But maintenance requires time, tools, and safe conditions, all of which were becoming harder to find as the war progressed. The more these tanks were used, the more problems they developed. And the more problems they developed, the less reliable they became. This created a cycle that was difficult to break. More use led to more damage. More damage led to more repairs. More repairs led to fewer tanks available. And fewer tanks meant weaker operations. Despite all this, the image of German tank superiority continued to exist. On paper, these machines were still among the best in the world. In controlled situations, they could still outperform many enemy tanks. But war is not decided on paper. It is decided by what actually works in real conditions. And in real conditions, these machines were beginning to fail. Not suddenly, not all at once, but gradually, one breakdown at a time, one delay at a time, one abandoned tank at a time. And as these failures continued to increase, Germany was being pushed toward a new kind of problem. A problem that had nothing to do with engineering alone. A problem that came from the environment itself. Because the next challenge these tanks would face was not mechanical. It was something far more unforgiving. The ground beneath them, and the conditions that would push these machines beyond their limits. By the time German tanks began facing serious mechanical problems, another challenge was already waiting for them. It was not an enemy army. It was not a new weapon. It was the land itself. As German forces moved deeper into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they encountered terrain that was completely different from what their machines had been designed for. The ground was unpredictable. Dry roads could quickly turn into deep mud. Open field could become traps after rain. And in many areas, There were no proper roads at all. For lighter and simpler vehicles, this was a challenge. For heavy German tanks, it became a disaster. The Tiger Tank, one of Germany's most powerful machines, also carried one of its biggest weaknesses: its weight. Weighing over 50 tons, the Tiger was extremely heavy. This gave it strong armor and stability in combat, but it also meant that the ground beneath it had to support that weight. In ideal conditions, this was not a problem. But war rarely offers ideal conditions. As rains began to fall and the famous Eastern Front mud season arrived, the terrain changed completely. Fields turned into thick, sticky mud. Roads became soft and unstable. And suddenly, movement became extremely difficult. German tanks that had once moved with confidence now struggled to advance. Tracks began to sink into the ground. Engines worked harder, trying to push the massive weight forward. Fuel consumption increased, and in many cases, the tanks simply stopped moving. Once a heavy tank became stuck in mud, getting it out was not easy. Recovery required other vehicles, equipment, and time. But in active war zones, time was limited and recovery vehicles were not always available. This meant that many tanks had to be left behind. Perfectly functional machines, abandoned because they could not move. The problem was not limited to mud. Bridges became another major obstacle. Many bridges in Eastern Europe were not built to support the weight of heavy tanks like the Tiger. When these tanks attempted to cross, the results could be catastrophic. Bridges collapsed. Tanks fell through structures. Routes had to be changed or delayed. This slowed down entire operations. German strategies often depended on speed and coordination. But when tanks could not cross rivers or had to take longer routes, that speed disappeared. And without speed, their advantage began to fade. The Panther tank, although lighter than the Tiger, also faced similar problems. Its design allowed for better mobility, but it was still heavy enough to struggle in difficult terrain. Tracks slipped. Suspension systems were pushed to their limits. Mechanical stress increased. Even when the tanks did not get completely stuck, their movement became slow and inefficient. This made them easier targets, not necessarily because they were weaker, but because they were no longer able to move freely. The battlefield was no longer a place where they could use their full power. Instead, it became a place where their weaknesses were exposed. Meanwhile, Soviet tanks like the T-34 were performing much better in these conditions. They were lighter. They had wider tracks that distributed weight more effectively. They were designed with rough terrain in mind. While German tanks struggled, Soviet tanks kept moving. This created a significant difference in mobility. Mobility is one of the most important factors in armored warfare. A tank that cannot move is not a threat. It becomes a target. And as German tanks slowed down or got stuck, they became easy to locate and attack. But even more importantly, they disrupted the flow of entire operations. When tanks stop, everything behind them stops. Supply lines are delayed. Infantry support is affected. Artillery coordination becomes harder. One stuck tank could block a narrow route. Several stuck tanks could stop an entire advance. This created a chain reaction. Small problems turned into larger ones. A delay in one area caused delays in others. Plans that depended on precise timing began to fail. German commanders were forced to adjust constantly, but adjustments in war often come at a cost. Every delay gave the enemy more time to prepare defenses, more time to organize counterattacks, more time to strengthen positions. The same tanks that were designed to break through enemy lines were now slowing down the advance. And this shift had a deeper impact. It changed how these machines were perceived. At the beginning of a war, German tanks were seen as unstoppable forces. Now, they were beginning to look vulnerable, not because they were weak in combat, but because they were struggling to reach combat. This is one of the most important turning points in understanding their failure. They were not defeated directly by enemy weapons. They were defeated by conditions they were not built to handle. And as the situation worsened, these conditions would become even more extreme. Because after mud comes something far more dangerous. Winter, a season that would not just challenge these machines, but completely shut them down. And when that happened, the problem would no longer be movement. It would be survival. As German tanks struggled through mud and rough terrain, another challenge was approaching. It was slower. It was quieter, but far more destructive. Winter. The Eastern Front was known for its harsh winters, but the scale of what German forces faced was beyond anything they had fully prepared for. Temperatures dropped far below freezing. Snow covered the ground. Ice formed on every surface, and the environment itself began to attack the machines. For soldiers, the cold was dangerous. For machines, it was devastating. Engines that had already been under stress now faced a new problem. Extreme cold caused engine oil to thicken. Instead of flowing smoothly, it became heavy and sluggish. This made it difficult for engines to start. In many cases, tanks simply refused to start at all. Crews had to spend hours trying to warm up engines, sometimes using fires underneath the tanks just to get them running. Even when engines started, they did not operate efficiently. Performance dropped, fuel consumption increased, and the risk of breakdown became even higher. Batteries also struggled in the cold. Low temperatures reduced their effectiveness. Without reliable batteries, starting the engine became even more difficult. This created a situation where a fully functional tank could become completely useless overnight. The cold did not stop at the engines. Weapon systems were affected as well. Guns became harder to operate. Lubricants inside moving parts froze or became less effective. This caused delays in firing. In some cases, weapons jammed completely. A tank that cannot fire is just as vulnerable as one that cannot move. Communication systems were also impacted. Equipment became less reliable. Coordination between units became harder. This added another layer of difficulty to already complex operations. The crews themselves were under extreme pressure. Operating a tank in freezing conditions required physical endurance. Cold affected their ability to work. Repairs became harder. Simple tasks took longer. Exposure to freezing temperatures reduced efficiency and increased fatigue. At the same time, the need for constant maintenance did not disappear. If anything, it became more urgent. Machines that were already prone to failure now required even more attention. But performing maintenance in freezing conditions was extremely difficult. Tools became hard to handle. Parts were harder to replace. Time was limited, and every moment spent outside the tank increased the risk to the crew. Many tanks were lost not because of enemy action, but because they could not be kept operational in these conditions. Some were abandoned after failing to start. Others were left behind after repeated mechanical issues. These machines, once symbols of power, were now standing still in the snow. Silent, useless. The environment had turned them into obstacles rather than weapons. Meanwhile, Soviet forces were better prepared for these conditions. Their equipment was designed with cold weather in mind. Their soldiers were more accustomed to the environment. Their operations continued, even as German machines struggled. This created a major imbalance. While one side slowed down, the other continued to move. And in war, movement often determined success. The winter did not just affect individual tanks. It affected entire strategies. German plans relied on speed, coordination, and continuous pressure. But the cold disrupted all of these. Delays became unavoidable. Coordination became difficult. Momentum was lost. And once momentum is lost, it is very hard to regain. This period marked a critical point in the war. German forces were no longer advancing as expected. Instead, they were struggling to maintain their position. The machines that were supposed to give them an advantage were now contributing to their difficulties. The idea of technological superiority was being tested against reality, and reality was proving to be far more demanding. No matter how advanced a machine is, it must be able to function in the environment where it is used. If it cannot, then its power becomes meaningless. The German tanks were still powerful. They still had strong armor. They still had deadly weapons. But power without reliability is not enough. And in the freezing conditions of the Eastern Front, reliability became the most important factor of all. As winter tightened its grip, the number of operational tanks continued to decrease. Some were repaired, many were not, and as these losses increased, a new problem began to grow, a problem that would affect not just individual tanks, but the entire German war effort, a problem that no amount of engineering could easily solve. Fuel, because even if a tank could move, even if it could fire, even if it survived the cold, without fuel, it could not function at all, and Germany was running out. By the later stages of World War II, Germany was no longer facing just one problem. Mechanical failures had weakened their tanks. Terrain had slowed them down. Winter had pushed their machines to the limit. But now, a new crisis began to take control of everything. Fuel. Modern warfare depends on fuel. Tanks, no matter how powerful, cannot move without it. Engines cannot run. Weapons cannot be positioned. Operations cannot continue. And Germany was running out. Fuel shortages began to affect every part of the German military. 4 tank units. The impact was immediate and severe. Missions had to be reduced. Movements were limited. Training was cut back. And in many cases, tanks were simply left behind because there was not enough fuel to operate them. Some units received orders to conserve fuel at all costs. This meant fewer patrols, fewer movements, and less flexibility on the battlefield. A tank that cannot move freely loses one of its greatest advantages. And as fuel became more scarce, this problem became more common. There were situations where fully operational tanks were abandoned during retreats, not because they were damaged, not because they were destroyed, but because there was no fuel left to move them. These machines, once designed to dominate battlefields, were now being left behind as silent reminders of a failing system. At the same time, Germany's enemies were increasing their strength. The United States and the Soviet Union were producing tanks in massive numbers. Their designs focused on reliability, ease of production, and practicality. The Sherman tank, used by the United States, was not as heavily armored as a Tiger. It was not as powerful in direct combat, but it had one key advantage. It worked. It could be produced quickly. It could be repaired easily. And most importantly, it could be deployed in large numbers. The Soviet T-34 followed a similar philosophy. It was simple, durable, and effective in harsh conditions. While German tanks struggled with complexity, Soviet tanks continued to operate in mud, snow, and extreme environments. This created a situation where Germany faced not just a technological challenge, but a numerical one. For every German tank on the battlefield, there could be several Allied tanks. And even if one Allied tank was destroyed, another could take its place. This constant pressure made it difficult for Germany to maintain control. The idea that a single powerful tank could defeat multiple weaker ones began to lose its effectiveness. Because in reality, the battlefield was not about isolated encounters. It was about sustained operations. It was about maintaining strength over time. And in that aspect, Germany was falling behind. Their tanks required more maintenance, more fuel, more effort, and they were available in smaller numbers. The Allies, on the other hand, focused on consistency. Their tanks kept moving. Their supply lines remained active. Their production continued. And slowly, this difference began to decide the outcome of the war. German armored units were no longer able to operate at full strength. Breakdowns reduced their numbers. Terrain slowed their movement. Winter damaged their systems. Fuel shortages limited their operations. Each of these problems alone was serious. But together, they created a situation that was impossible to overcome. The tanks that were once seen as a pride of German engineering were now becoming a liability. They consumed resources that Germany could no longer afford. They required attention that could not always be given. And they failed at moments when reliability was most needed. As Allied forces advanced from multiple directions, Germany's ability to respond weakened. Defensive positions were harder to maintain. Counterattacks became less effective. And slowly, the balance of power shifted. By the final stages of the war, many German tanks were no longer destroyed in battle. They were abandoned, left behind due to lack of fuel, left behind due to mechanical failure, left behind because they could not keep up. These abandoned machines tell a powerful story, a story not just of war, but of design and decision-making. Germany built some of the most advanced tanks of the time. They pushed engineering to its limits. They created machines that were feared and respected. But in doing so, they overlooked something critical: simplicity, reliability, adaptability. War is not just about having the strongest weapon. It is about having a weapon that works under all conditions, a weapon that can be repaired quickly, a weapon that can be produced in large numbers, a weapon that can keep going no matter the situation. In the end, Germany's tanks were not defeated because they were weak. They were defeated because they were too complex, too demanding, too dependent on perfect conditions. And war is never perfect. The Allies did not win because they had better individual machines. They won because their machines worked consistently, because they could replace losses, because they could adapt, and because they understood that in war, reliability matters more than perfection. As the war came to an end, the image of German tank superiority faded. What remained were abandoned vehicles, broken machines, and the lessons learned from their failure. This is a story of how some of the most powerful tanks ever built became symbols of a deeper problem, a problem that goes beyond engineering, a problem of priorities. Because sometimes, in the pursuit of building the perfect machine, you forget to build one that actually works. And in war, that difference can decide everything. Germany didn't lose the war because they lacked power. They lost it because their power couldn't last.